So this is part two of the Cold War, and we left off with the Marshall Plan. So here is the Marshall Plan and how it aids Western Europe. It provides it proved to be a great success in rebuilding Europe, um, but as you see, within 4 years, the countries receiving aid saw 41% higher industrial production than those on the eve of World War II. And of course, if you want to hear a little more about this and the benefits to the U.S. and businesses, you can check out the video here, Noam Chomsky, the Marshall Plan Reexamined. He's a professor at MIT, a historian. He's quite famous. But anyway, you can check that out. So as you see, the big thing you need to get out of this is that Western European countries were stabilized. Imports and exports were rising rapidly. It looks like democracy and our form of stability is working for them. And I believe we'll see if there's a stat here, but basically the threat of communism will no longer exist in Western Europe. So the thing you need to get out of it is we also defeat communism through westernization and a policy, not a war. So in 1948, the U.S., Britain, and France reunify the western part of Germany, and this freaks out the Soviets. Remember, Stalin wanted to keep Germany divided and weak forever. Well, now we have reunited the western part of Germany, and we call it West Germany. So Stalin's response to this was he blocked entry into West Berlin. Remember, it's 150 miles inside of East Germany. Stalin basically told the western part of the world, give up on reunification or give up on West Berlin. Because once again, the Soviets are freaked out. They do not want Germany to reunite. They lost 29 million people in 27 years. So the U.S. and Britain's response to this was an 11-month airlift, supplying West Berlin by air. The U.S. and Britain airlift supplies to West Berliners. Who looks bad in world opinion? It's going to be the Soviet Union. Did Stalin have a right to do this? Well, he had justification through 29 million people dead, but we don't talk about that. And in the world's eyes, the U.S. and Britain look really good. Stalin does not. He looks more like a bully. So here's the next thing we're going to do that freaked the Soviets out is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949. And if you look down here in the bottom, to protect Western Europe from Soviet aggression, I want to go back to this real quick. This will be the first peacetime treaty or the first peacetime alliance the U.S. will sign. We sign alliances in times of war, but we had never done it in peacetime. And nobody's fighting a physical war at this time. And it's the first time we sign a peacetime treaty or a peacetime alliance. Well, that just started us. That was the first. We're going to sign many. In 1951, we signed the U.S., Australian, New Zealand alliance, the ANZUS. And we pledge against or pledge to assist each other if attacked by the communists. This is an example of collective security. If this sounds like the alliance system that got us into World War I or got the Europeans into World War I, it's just another name for an alliance system. But yes, collective security, alliance system is the same thing. Just years go by and you call it by a different name. 1954, SEATO is created. This is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, created to oppose communist expansion. Think about Vietnam. France owns Vietnam up until 1954 when they lose a battle, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And so, yeah. The big question mark, Vietnam. The Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is going to be created by the Soviet Union because we actually allow Germany into NATO. So if you look at this stuff and you're saying, wait a minute, it sounds like Stalin, it reacts to what the West does, you'd be right. It's an alliance of Eastern communist powers formed to respond to Germany entering NATO. So keep in mind, to the Soviets, to Stalin, it looks like we are creating another nation that could eventually invade his country. And there's a lot of things that have happened here between 1946 and 1955 that we look like we're more the aggressors and on the German side than than protecting Soviet interests, I guess you could say, because remember we were allies in World War II. So this really freaks the Soviets out, and they formed the Warsaw Pact. Here's some PowerPoints there you could look at, some slides you could look at, but we got to move on to China. China's going to become a communist nation. Chinese Civil War had existed from 1922 to roughly 37, 38. The Chinese agreed to put their differences aside and fight the common enemy, which was Japan. And after the war's over in 1945, communists and nationalists go right back to fighting one another. What this is going to lead to is the communists, led by Mao Zedong, the gentleman up there in the top right-hand corner. He overthrows the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalist government was a democratic government from 1922 to 1949, and it was very corrupt. 95% of all Chinese lived in obscure poverty. 5% prospered. So we actually had government officials coming back under the Truman administration and just saying how bad the government was and how corrupt it was. And so these nationalists will take exile in Taiwan. We still support Taiwan today, but China does not like it when we acknowledge Taiwan as a nation. That actually got President Trump into trouble when he first became president because he acknowledged Taiwan, and that made the Chinese leadership extremely upset. So, North Korean War. We're going to spend a minute on this. Oh, not that quick though. So, with the North Korean War, you have Korea was a colony of Japan from 1910 to 1945. Well, remember Stalin had promised to help in Asia as soon as the war in Europe was over. And as far as he got was the northern part of Korea. So when the Japanese surrender in World War II, the southern part of Korea surrenders to the U.S., the northern part surrendered to Stalin and the communists. So this sets up North Korea as a communist state. And in 1950, North Korea wants to unify all of Korea like it had been for its history. So they invade South Korea. The UN steps in. They send troops to repulse the invasion. China comes to the aid of North Korea. And as you see here are some of the leaders. These are the first two leaders of North Korea. Kim Il-sung, he was the first leader, and Syngman Rhee was his son, and Syngman Rhee was the leader of South Korea. He's not related. So, the North Korean War. Let's see, here's the 38th parallel right here. This is where North Korea split to this day. We'll read over this quickly. June 25th, 1950, North Koreans invade South Korea. UN forces under Douglas MacArthur, who was called away from rebuilding Japan, which he had done very successfully. He leads aid in South Korea. Communist forces pushed the UN forces to the brink of defeat. If you look down here, this is where the communist forces were. This is what's left of South Korea. UN forces pushed the Koreans back to the border of China. So when the UN and the US get involved, we push the North Koreans back to this line right here. So China's going to enter the war when we get up there about 300 miles from the Chinese border, and they send over about 200,000 Chinese soldiers. And because China enters the war, Douglas MacArthur begs or really pleads with Harry Truman to use the atomic bomb on the Chinese and the North Koreans. Truman says no. Truman says we're going to keep this. We're going to make this a limited war, the first time in world history that this has been tried. And MacArthur criticizes him in, I think, his Life magazine. One of the magazines at the time, MacArthur criticizes his boss, and so Truman will fire MacArthur, and Truman's heavily criticized for that because he's a war hero. Keep in mind, this is not the first time that MacArthur defies orders from a president. Truman fires him. When he returns home, MacArthur gets a ticker tape parade through New York, and Truman's heavily criticized for this. But did Truman do the right thing? He did. We suspected the Chinese and the Soviets had a pact, and they did. We didn't know it at the time, but yes, if we were to bomb China, the Soviet Union would have bombed us, or bombed South Korea and Japan. So, if you look here, the war ends in a stalemate. To this day, there's no peace treaty. Korea is divided at the 38th parallel. It marks an important turning point in the Cold War. The U.S. began a major military buildup, and we are going to continue to modern day time. Look at the cost of the war, 54,000 dead in 3 years. Keep in mind, we lose 58,000 in 8 years, really 20-something years in Vietnam. Look at the money, $20 to $22 billion were spent on this war. The political cost, Truman's not going to run for president in 1952. He could have, but he didn't. And his approval rating when he left office was 33%, one of the lowest in U.S. history. Not the lowest, but one of. Since then, you go back and look at what Truman did, and he's considered one of the most important presidents that we've had. He did a lot better job than we thought. His big problem would be, criticism would be how he handled Stalin. But moving on, as you see, there's no real victory. You need to know what brinksmanship is. Basically, this comes under Eisenhower, and this is to basically be ready for war at all times. It's going to lead to the race for the H-bomb, which the hydrogen bomb is 100,000 times stronger than the atom bomb. We detonate our first one in 1952. Truman decides to do this to upgrade. We actually found out we could invent the H-bomb during the Manhattan Project, but we didn't spend time on it then. The Soviets would detonate theirs in 1953. The policy of brinksmanship comes about by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and it means to be on the brink of war at all times. What branches of the military will be trimmed? All of them, except for the Air Force, because the Air Force will be expanded to carry nuclear weapons. Check out this video, Evolution of Nuclear Weapons. It's really interesting. Cold War spreads around the world. As you see, Eisenhower creates the CIA. These are covert operations. Our very first operation was in Iran. We basically ousted a democratically elected leader of Iran to put a leader that was pro-American in there. And the elected leader of Iran wanted to nationalize things and, kind of Iran first. And we didn't like that because American businesses didn't like it. So the CIA ousted him in a coup d'etat and put in a pro-American leader. So, and that's going to come back to get us in 1979. Some hot spots you might want to look at: Egypt and Hungary in 1956. Eisenhower in Geneva, he proposes the open skies, which will allow flights over each other's countries, so we could see what each other was doing nuclear weapons wise. The Soviet Union feared this. The Soviet Union feared this because they knew that we outnumbered them in nuclear weapons almost 10 to 1. So it didn't accomplish anything, but the public hails this conference.